Hi, good evening, everyone. Hello.
Hey Lawrence, hey guys.
Hello, so good to see you all again.
Yep, it's us again.
Uh,
Yeah,
how's how's everything, guys?
Yep, all good, all good. But the weather is
yeah,
just a bit warm.
yeah. I think this is one of the very rare occasions whereby, like, we have GTG Singapore and Big O kind of coming together once again. As I
Mm.
think a lot of the people who have been watching might know, this one has been running a lot of the Android events for for quite some time for the year, and now we have him again to kind of share this time with us to talk to Chet later on. Um, yeah.
Cool. Yep. So let's enter the session. So I'll start with it first, and then I'll pass it on to you guys, right? So hi everyone. Thank you for tuning in to the live stream today. So hi, I'm Lawrence from the Google Developer Space team. Let me briefly introduce about Google Developer Space. So Google Developer Space is a platform for developers and startup around the region to learn, connect, engage, and be inspired. I have to really thank Julius and Wei Yuan, for bringing such a great event today. I'm looking forward to Chat, who's going to talk a little bit about his experience, right? Yeah, so looking forward to it. Yeah, pass it on to you guys.
Okay, so moving on to our socials. So if you are new to our events, right, for Big O, big welcome to all of you. And for those who are joining us back, I think usually we'll see a few familiar names here and there. Welcome back again. And today we have a really, really exciting event for all of you. But if you're new here, definitely do, go click our different socials here, because we are kind of like influencers now, and I have to say stuff like, share, and subscribe. But I'll say it at the end again later on. But definitely, do check out our YouTube channel. Hopefully, if you are watching from YouTube or if you're on Facebook, hi to you on Facebook. Um, do put in like write comments in your like whether you are in Facebook Live or in YouTube. We'll be able to see your comments. In fact, the speaker later on he'll be able to see your comments as well. So if you have questions, do put it inside the live chat. Besides the YouTube channel, you can also follow our Facebook page, our community page in terms of following our different events that are going to be coming. And we're going to be talking about these events in a little bit.
Yeah,
Right?
so
So, go
yeah,
ahead, Julius.
no, you should take the stage. Go ahead.
You should go. You should go.
I think, yeah, so I guess to kind of briefly introduce our speaker, right? So Chet has been around and very, very familiar to many of us Android engineers. He has been with Google, I think, 2010, and maybe Chet will correct me later on if my facts aren't correct. So he's been there for a while, being a DevRel for quite some time, and then kind of switching between graphics engineer and then moving to DevRel. And I think now he's back doing Android graphics. We have seen him for quite some time in a lot of those Android tutorials and so forth. So we are very lucky to have him today to talk about the history of Android and how projects succeed and the lessons learned around building the Android OS. Uh, yeah, so that said, I'm gonna throw it back to Wayan. Oops, not Wayan. Sorry, Lawrence.
Don't worry, don't worry. So we're gonna create more and more good contents for everyone, especially the developer space. If you like our content, please subscribe to all our social channels. Yeah, and also do also follow Big O's channels as well.
Right. So a little bit of a sneak peek of the events that are going to be coming soon. So we have our second iteration, or it's kind of like episode three, but because we started zero counting, we started with episode zero a few months ago. We're gonna have a very exciting event that is going to be coming in 1 week. Next Wednesday, actually at this exact time as well. We're going to be talking about volunteering in the tech community. So for those who are already doing that, don't worry. There's going to be like extra insights from our speaker. You can see over there. That's like one of the big weeks of volunteering in Singapore, Michael. But for those who have not tried out volunteering before, I think this is also a really good opportunity for you to sit in and understand, what is the pros and cons of doing that, and how can it help to drive your own career as well, right? So do check out the details for this event, and hope to be able to see you there.
Yeah, so as you all might know as well, Android Dev Summit is happening later today and also tomorrow. And as part of celebrating Android Dev Summit, we actually invited some of our partner DevRels in Singapore to talk about Android as well. So Sagar, probably not too familiar with everyone. Sagar is new, and this will be the first time that Sagar will be sharing with us on what's new also in Android 12. So please watch out for it. That's 2 weeks from now, 1 week after Michael's event. And of course, someone who's not a stranger to Singapore, we also have Xiaotao who's going to talk to us about Google Pay billing also at the same time. So please watch out for it and hope you can also be there as well to celebrate Android Dev Summit extended with us. Finally, we have our friend from Facebook. Interestingly, she also works on Android. She works on TV, she works on web apps, and to some extent also she was working on mobile apps. So she has been an IC for more than 20 years. So for many of our previous guests, right, they're directors of engineering, vice president. But here's a very, very good experience very good guest whereby we can learn a lot about how it looks like staying as an IC for more than 20 years and all the experiences, all the mistakes, and all the things that she could give us advice on to supercharge our career. So we look forward to that. That will be on the early December. And as we have more information about her talk, we will be updating it. Cool. I think without further ado, we are jumping to the backstage and welcoming our special guest for today, Chet. Hello, Chet.
Hello. This must be the time and the place. Should I start the talk?
Right. So we're jumping back now. Enjoy.
All right. Thanks. Hey, everyone. I would say that it's nice to see you, but all I'm looking at is myself, and I see myself all the time. So that's just normal. In the meantime, thanks for tuning in. Thanks for paying attention for this talk that I'm going to have today. It's a little bit different from most of the talks that I give. This is not technical. It's basically taking a step back from the Android operating system and all the platform stuff that I do in the engineering team and asking the question, why did Android succeed and what can we learn from that for other projects like all of the ones that we all work on in our entire careers. So I am Chet Haase, as they said many times. You can find me on Twitter there. I was curious to see in the comments for the stream that they were asking, when did people start developing on Android? And someone said Gingerbread. And I thought, oh, me too. I did join the team in 2010. As Julia said, that was correct. About midway through 2010, I joined ostensibly to work on the animation framework to begin with on the Honeycomb release, but I did a little bit of Gingerbread because that was also under development at the same time, which was a common thing on Android at the time to actually be working on 2 releases in parallel, which was part of why the team was running so fast and working so hard for many years. So a lot of the stuff that I'm going to talk about today, most of it comes from a book. So I wrote a book that took me about 4 years to do all of the interviews and the research for it with people that were on the early team to figure out how Android came together. I put that together. I finally published that in August. That is now available on Amazon. It is self-published. For now, it will be more widely available through a publisher sometime next year. It's over 400 pages, and a lot of those pages are filled with footnotes. And it is, as I said, it's available on Amazon. The ebook is available on some other stores. There's wider distribution from an actual publisher. So hopefully it'll be a little bit easier to get outside of the Amazon circles eventually. And I'm also working on an audiobook. As soon as I go home, I'll start recording that again. So sometime there will be something to listen to. I want to point out that I'm not trying to sell the book here. What I really want to do is have people read the story. I'm not actually making money on the book. All the profits are being donated to tech-related charities. I just hope that people enjoy the story. The whole reason I wrote it was because I thought it was a really interesting story, how it came together and how it happened to succeed. And the people that worked on it, the team, was really interesting. And I wanted to share that story with as wide an audience as possible, not just in the Android community, but I think it's sort of an interesting story about tech in general. I think that's, as we all know, there's such a interrelationship of all of the people and the companies and the technologies, and everything that we do with our career ends up relating to other things that we do. And this is one glimpse into that. And there are many others out there. I just find it sort of a fascinating topic. Anyway, let's start talking about Android history. So way back in 2003, toward the end of 2003, there was a startup formed called Photo Farm. This was formed by Andy Rubin and Chris White, who had been colleagues at WebTV. Andy Rubin had also founded Danger by that time, and he and Chris thought cameras are really awful. That is, digital cameras were coming online. The lenses, like all the actual camera technology, was amazing by that point. It's been amazing for a while, but they were marrying that with digital technology, like being able to save large, high-resolution pictures, do some processing on the camera, and upload those. And digital photography was finally becoming a thing. And they thought, well, the cameras are really good, but the actual computer part of that, the operating system stuff, is awful. The networking capabilities are really terrible. How you interface with the network was bad. The user interfaces were terrible. And they thought, we could fix this. We could provide an open source platform that camera manufacturers could use. And we would like to do that with our company. So they spent 2004 basically developing the ideas behind that, and then shopping it around to investors, especially in Silicon Valley, where they were located, and nobody wanted any piece of it. Venture capitalists simply weren't interested. They didn't see the market. For one thing, cameras at that time in 2004 were starting to be integrated into even feature phones. They weren't very good cameras, but you could sort of squint and see that in the future, maybe cameras was not going to be a great big market. So maybe this wasn't something that investors actually wanted to spend money on. So toward the end of this cycle, at the end of 2004, a couple of people that Andy Rubin had worked with before in his previous life in Danger approached him. One was Rich Miner, who was an early investor in Danger through his company, Orange Telecom, and their venture fund, and Nick Sears, who was working at T-Mobile and had worked closely with Danger to launch the Danger devices that they had, the T-Mobile Sidekick devices. And they approached him and said, well, people don't want a camera, but they do want phones. So what about doing phones instead? And Andy Rubin especially didn't want to do phones because he had just done phones. He had done that at Danger. He'd had enough of that. That's why he was thinking cameras. But he said, okay, well, I'll look into it. And in one of his conversations with venture capitalists, he mentioned, well, what if we do phones? And all the ears perked up because now the investors were actually interested. Like maybe there's something there. Maybe there is room in the market and interest in the market for somebody to be taking a look at a smartphone platform. So Rich and Nick joined Android around that time and helped develop a business plan and this marketing pitch. They developed a slide deck. So here's a couple of slides from that original presentation, which they then shopped around to venture capitalists and investors in Silicon Valley, but also on the East Coast, saying, okay, well, here's our plan. And this is really the key slide from that entire presentation. There are two important points here. One, if you look at the first two bullet points there, you can see that the number of phones shipping in the world already dwarfed the number of desktop platforms that were available. So everybody at that time thought of the computing devices that people had as being the desktop devices that they were using every day. But if you looked at the number of phones being shipped, it was already 4 times that. And that market was just growing every year, whereas PCs were really flatlined, right? I mean, everybody kept buying PCs, but not at an increasing rate. And so you could look at this market and say, well, there's more opportunity in phones than there are in desktops. Now, you have to understand, of course, most of those phones were feature phones. They didn't really do much beyond phone calls and messaging. Right? They weren't even really good at email, and the browsers on the phones, if they had a browser, they were really terrible, right? But if you look at the third bullet point, it talks about the capabilities of the hardware finally getting to a point where maybe the world could make phones that were more capable and could be a common computing platform. And now you could think that maybe phones could be the next computing platform that was going to dwarf what was happening in the PC space. And that was really interesting. So that attracted interest from venture capitalists, two of the firms that they talked to in the East Coast were interested and said, okay, here's an offer. We will give you, so-and-so money. And the company went back and thought about that. And at the same time, they had a couple of really interesting meetings with Google, at the end of which Google said, you know what, we're really interested in what you would like to achieve with Android. What if we acquire you and allow you to do that here instead of on your own? And this was worth consideration. It wasn't a slam dunk. Like, acquisition by Google is fantastic, but it's also really exciting, especially to entrepreneurs, to try to do something on their own. But they thought, maybe we have a better chance of succeeding with this vision if we actually do it at a company like Google instead of trying to do it on our own. So in July of 2005, they sort of had worked through the details of, money and timing and how this is going to work to actually try to achieve this project at Google. And in July of 2005, they were acquired and they started at Google. And one of the important things, so I saw this mentioned online recently that, Google had bought Android and then they just sort of, shipped it. That is totally untrue. What they bought was a demo. They bought about 3,000 lines of JavaScript. And that was it, right? So they had a vision. They knew what they wanted to accomplish, which was an open source operating system. And they had a demo showing how some of this stuff may look in the future. By the way, it looks quite different than it did then, the UI and the interaction points and, the capabilities of its devices. But they had sort of a general idea of the direction they wanted to go in. But that's not what Google bought. They didn't buy the platform. What they bought was the demo. Right. And some clever people, but only 3 of those people were actually writing code at that time. There were 3 engineers, and then there was an administrative assistant who worked with the executive team and those 4 founders that I mentioned before. And that was it. Right. It was basically an idea. They bought the idea and then development on the platform began. So they basically pushed reboot as of July of 2005 and started hiring and building in earnest to try to get to 1.0. So between 2005 and late 2008, they basically had to get to 1.0. And that meant we needed to build the kernel, which was based on the Linux kernel, which is great. We didn't need to, write an entire kernel on our own. Instead, it was more about adding capabilities to the existing kernel, things like wake locks, which did not exist in the real world, but were completely necessary for mobile devices. More importantly, the team had to provide the drivers so that Linux kernel could actually operate on the CPU and the nascent GPUs and the display and the sensors and SD card and all of these pieces of the hardware that the platform needed to talk to. Those drivers didn't exist. So that's basically what the systems team did on Android, was to provide the drivers so that you could connect the dots between the hardware and the software that was being written. We also had to provide a language. And in the beginning, there was an idea that maybe we would choose from one of 3 languages, or maybe we would actually do all 3. So the 3 under debate were JavaScript, which is where the demo started. And some people preferred the JavaScript approach, maybe because they came from the web world, or the Skia folks, I think, like some of the JavaScript stuff. They were working with that with some of their early graphics and UI developments. There was another contingent that was very loud and vocal about using C++. They came more from the embedded space, and especially devices at that time, like dealing with memory and performance of everything was paramount. You really couldn't cut corners and expect that, some bloated runtime would just handle the details for you. So C++ was a really good way to achieve that, but it was a higher learning curve for developers. And so the eventual decision taken, which, the team debated it for a while, and then eventually Andy came in and said, you know what, we're doing Java. That is the decision. This will be the one language that we use for the API of Android. So they used the Java programming language. And one of the big reasons behind that was developers everywhere knew Java. It's a learning language. It was a development language on desktops, on servers, for middleware. Everybody had, libraries and best practices they knew. And so it really lowered the barrier of entry to coming onto this new platform. Sure, you needed to understand mobile devices. You needed to understand the new Android APIs, but at least you knew how the language worked and you knew about runtimes. And so that was just kind of an easier entry for all of these potentially new developers. So if they're going to pick a language, especially a language like the Java programming language, then they needed to develop a runtime for that. So they brought in runtime experts who eventually built the Dalvik runtime so that you could run the bytecode that was being produced from the Java programming language code that was being written. On top of that, you had the framework being developed and all the APIs for getting at the operating system capabilities. You had the UI toolkit sitting beside the framework, providing all the visual pieces, the buttons and the events and interaction with the users. You had the graphic stack that actually took all of that information from the UI toolkit and got the pixels to display on the screen and buffered those things and put them into windows and composited them together. You had media, so you had both audio and video stuff that needed to be written or acquired. In the case of video, they acquired technology from an external company. And you had the system UI so that you could have a home screen, you could have a way to launch these applications and navigate around the space. On top of all of that, then you had applications. So there was an expectation early on that hopefully external developers would become Android developers and develop those applications for the platform. But there were obviously important applications that a lot of people depended on Google for, and Google was shipping these applications on other platforms, obviously the web, but also some mobile platforms at that time. And so they needed to make these kinds of applications, Gmail, contacts, calendar, maps, YouTube. They wanted them to work on Android as well. And the teams at Google weren't interested in that because Android didn't even really exist. So why would they spend their time on that? So the Android team itself took on that work internally to build those applications at that time. Of course, the important part of those applications wasn't the UI, it was the connection to the back end. You needed the ability for Gmail to send a message through the server and then off to the recipient. Or if somebody sent you an email, it needed to arrive at the server and then communicate with your phone through this persistent connection that they established, and then download that information so that you could see it on your phone. And same with the rest of these applications. All of the data is stored in the cloud, so then you need a way to actually talk to the cloud constantly, persistently, in order for those applications to be usable and interesting. And then Android Market came into being, again, from the early days. They wanted there to be a marketplace where developers could easily write an application, upload it to a store, and then have users anywhere in the world download these applications. This is an interesting point because now, obviously, there's an application store. How could it be otherwise? But it was really quite different at that time. In fact, when the iPhone first came out, they did not have an app store. Not only that, but they had no intention of having an app store. When pressed, they said, well, maybe developers could write web apps and that'll be good enough. But we, Apple, will provide these curated applications. And that's really the best way for us to control the experience on their device. And then eventually, partly as a result of, Android Market being out there and becoming a reality for developers to ship applications, they put pressure on Apple and said, no, actually, you need an app store. You need to let us in. And that is the best approach, right? Because sure, everybody wants, maybe a Gmail or a YouTube or a Maps application from Google that has these services, but the amount of applications and capabilities provided by external developers dwarfs anything that any one company can provide. And so having an application ecosystem is so critical to a smartphone platform being relevant today that you couldn't introduce, if you came out with the best hardware and the best software platform in the world, if you did not have an application store, it wouldn't matter. No one would care, because the really important thing on any phone platform is all of the application capabilities, not, how the particular UI works or how fast that phone is. And so that vision in the early days to say, well, the application marketplace is going to be really important was key. And then finally, they came out with an SDK, and this meant having the Eclipse plugin so that you could actually write the code and build it and debug it and profile it. It meant tutorials and samples. It meant reference documentation and guides. It meant all of the pieces that developers needed in order to understand what this platform was and then be able to write applications for it. Again, lower the barrier of entry as much as possible to make sure that people new to this platform had a reason to pay attention to it, and to make it as easy as possible for them to actually do something about it and hopefully ship applications when Market was available, when 1.0 was finally there. So in the middle of this, then 2007 hit, and the big event for Android and smartphones in general was that the iPhone came out. So in January, there was an announcement that there would be an iPhone. Steve Jobs got up on stage and said, hey, what about this thing? And then in June, 6 months later, they actually shipped the device. And in the meantime, Android didn't even exist outside of rumors. Nobody knew what was going on. Even inside of Google, nobody really knew what was going on with Android. And so that it was very quiet from the Android space. And then iPhone came out and sort of captured a lot of attention. One of the things that it did was it changed the dynamics in the smartphone space, so that now touchscreens became a checkbox item that had to be on any smartphone coming out. This means that anybody that wanted to compete with the iPhone, with the Apple devices that were coming out, needed to have a touchscreen capability on their platform, right? So this changed the dynamics internally for Android. Now, they had always planned on having touchscreen capabilities, and they had built some of that infrastructure already. In fact, touchscreens, I should point out, touchscreens weren't invented by the iPhone. In fact, there was a LG Prada device that came out shortly before the iPhone that had a touchscreen, and touchscreen had existed in other form factors for years. Right. So it wasn't that they invented the notion of touchscreen, but it was the way that they sort of built it in with everything else that they were providing that gave everybody an aha going, well, yeah, actually, this needs to be there as a possibility if you're going to call yourself a smartphone. So Android was developing that capability, but it was a secondary capability. They were first going to come out with a device called the Sooner because it was going to launch sooner. And it was really more of a BlackBerry competitor. It had a small screen, which didn't have touchscreen capability, and it sat above a hardware keyboard, much like the BlackBerry devices did at the time. And that was what they were going to go with. And then they saw the iPhone announcement and said, okay, well, this device no longer makes sense. We cannot compete in the smartphone market with a BlackBerry competitor. We need to compete with a touchscreen. And so they changed priorities and they said, okay, let's kill that first device. And the first device for Android will instead be what they were calling the Dream device, which was based on a HTC Dream. And then it became the G1. And that did have touchscreen. It also had many other kinds of input, including the hardware keyboard that slid out. And I think there was a D-pad and there was a trackball, all kinds of things in there. But it did include the touchscreen capability that really needed to be there on any smartphone that wanted to compete. And then finally, in October of 2007, the SDK launched. Now everybody else in the world could see what Android was trying to achieve, and they could play around with the early bits and actually build applications. They couldn't run them on any device because nobody outside the Android team could get hold of hardware that would run Android, but they could run it on the emulator that was provided as part of the SDK. And then further SDKs would be shipping along the way, and they could continue rebuilding their application for future capabilities as everybody was gearing up for 1.0. In October of 2008, they finally made it to 1.0. They shipped that release, and they also shipped the device that was based on it, the T-Mobile G1. And they also made good on their promise to open source everything. This was always in the plans from the beginning. A little bit hard to believe that a company would put in this much work, including companies that they acquired for a lot of money so that they could take their source code and just give it away. But they did. They said, here is an entire platform. You manufacturers can take the platform, download it, build it, write whatever else you need to write drivers for your specific form factor, and go with it. Right. This was kind of a new thing. Like there was the Apple universe where they didn't make their platform available outside of Apple. And there was the other licensing universe where Microsoft, for example, had a platform that you could license from Microsoft for a fee, but you couldn't see the code there. So it was a little bit harder to port. It took more effort. It was more of a black box, and it costs you money. It costs you money per handset. But now Android was coming out saying, no, this is everything you need. And by the way, the price is $0. So now 2008 is over. We get into 2009. And then where are the users? So if you look at this graph, that green line over at the right is basically 0 compared to everybody else in the market. So I joined a little bit after this, halfway through 2010, and Android was in a solid 3rd, 4th, 5th place in the market, right? And it wasn't clear whether it was going to get better than that because there were other obvious and popular platforms that people were using out there, including the iPhone that had launched and just gotten more and more popular over time. So if we take a look at the overview of the timeline, got that founding back in 2003, you get acquired in 2005, iPhone comes out, then Public SDK, and then 1.0 and G1 shipped. And then at the end of 2009, the interesting development for Android was the Droid shipped. And that was really the first device, at least in the US, that really had an uptick in terms of consumer interest and sales. And all of a sudden, the graph started to change. We'll see that in a little bit. And then a few months later, I joined the Android team, still working on Gingerbread and just starting up Honeycomb development at that time. So in 2010, around that time that I joined, the hockey stick started. So when I got there, we were, as I said, clearly in 3rd or 4th or 5th place. solidly so. There were other people. Nokia was shipping most of the phones in the world. Microsoft was doing just fine, and you should always fear Microsoft. Apple was doing better and better. Like all of these things, BlackBerry just had this incredibly loyal following in the enterprise space. But then what we saw was something more like this. So over the course of 2010, by the time we got to 2011 even, Android was selling more devices through the world than all of these other smartphone manufacturers. And at the same time, even getting more popular than some of the feature phone offerings out there. And then we look at it today, as of last May, we got these 3 billion devices running Android in the world. So the whole idea behind the book was like, as this thing became more and more successful, certainly starting from its uncertain beginnings, the question was, how did that happen? Like, why did Android work? What were the factors that led to its success when, frankly, it was not really a given at the time? You may look back at it in hindsight and say, well, Google has a lot of money and therefore they shipped a phone and that's why it was successful. But that is absolutely not the case. I know many, many successful companies. I've worked at them that have tried many things that do not succeed. You can't just pour money onto a thing and then know that it's going to succeed. And there were so many things going against Android at the time that maybe aren't obvious now in hindsight. For one thing, as I said, it was a tiny little startup company, right? They only acquired 8 people in a vision. They didn't acquire a product at all. They built a product when they got to Google. There were also incredibly successful competitors in the market at the time. This wasn't like everybody started at the same starting line and, then Google ran up against Microsoft or whatever. No. All of these companies were in the market and doing well already, including the iPhone that had launched a year earlier, a year and a half earlier. And so they had already a bunch of gains on where Android was beginning, which was at 0. And they already knew how to launch and continue to deliver consumer devices, right? So all of this incredibly strong competition out there, including Nokia, 70% market share in the world. RIM, as I said, just these diehard enterprise fans. Microsoft, if a colleague said years ago in another company, if Microsoft gets into your market, get out. They are really good at shipping software. They have smart people, they have smart business people, and they know how to build products and ship them. And if that 1.0 doesn't work, they'll do a 2.0. And if that's not successful, they'll do a third version and they'll just keep going. If they want to be in the market, they will be. They'll figure it out eventually. And so just the fact that Microsoft was there, they may not have been on top, but the expectation was that they would be. And then the iPhone launched just to make it more and more complicated. Like, not only was there really killer competition from all these other successful companies, but then Apple gets into the game and says, okay, well, here's our new consumer device. And yet we have graphs like this where, by 2013, not only had Android gotten very popular compared to the other smartphone platforms in the world, but it also became the default choice for a phone overall. Right. So if we look at feature phone adoption, that was always, until, Android and the modern smartphones, the thing that people would choose if they needed a communication device. Much, much, much cheaper. And it just gave them limited capabilities, but it also didn't cost them data plans, right? They didn't pay for, all of the data that they were, sucking down onto the phones because it didn't exist. They could make phone calls and they could message, and that was about it. That's what they needed. And that was all they could afford, or that was all they, thought was reasonable. And then smartphones came out and proliferated so much that the prices came way down, the types of form factors and the capabilities of those devices became more and more interesting. And now people across the world were choosing smartphones instead. And more they were choosing Android to be that smartphone. So as I talked to the team and as I did research on this for the book, I boiled down the factors that led to Android's success into essentially 3 categories. One was the team of people itself who were working on this and the capabilities that they had and the efforts they put into it. Another was the decisions that team made early on, just the vision of where Android wanted to go, as well as decisions on technology and business factors as they were developing the platform that I think helped it succeed. And then third is the undeniable part of timing. So if we first look at the team, one of the things that I realized early on that I thought was really interesting that I wanted to talk about in the book was how many of the people worked together before they got to Android. This is a factor in tech in general. It is particularly a factor in Silicon Valley, where there are so many companies that are within walking distance or or painful traffic-laden driving distance of each other, all over the valley, right? So it has always been a dynamic in my career and everybody else's career in the area that if you don't like what your company is doing, you can just leave that job and walk down the street and work for another company that is doing something more interesting instead, still in a field that you like. And this is a factor overall in tech, but it was really a factor in Android where everybody on the team, the majority of the people on the team up through halfway through 2006, came from one of essentially 3 companies where they had worked together. Some of them even worked at 2 or 3 of these companies together. One was Danger. This came up before because this was Andy Rubin's startup. So he founded that with two other founders. But many of the early Android people had worked there. People like Brian Swetlin and FICO's Kirkpatrick and a bunch of other people learned a lot about developing for a mobile platform, a smartphone platform that was much, much more limited. So they were shipping these devices from Danger back in 2000, 2001 that were incredibly limited compared to the G1, and yet they made it work. They were using the Java programming language, similar model of building their own custom bytecode from that and then having a runtime deal with that. But even more restrictive things like, only one application would run at a time because they didn't have memory to run more. You couldn't really install that many applications. So they had an app store, but it was a lot different in those days. But you really couldn't run that many applications at a time. And eventually the device would run out of memory and then it would need to reboot just to run these things again. But they had a lot of the fundamentals that they learned at Danger along the way. There were other people that joined a company called B. I don't know if you've heard of it. If you're a consumer rather than a developer, you probably haven't heard of it because it didn't really work. It's a company that started in the early 90s with the idea that it wanted to compete against the operating systems offered by Apple and Microsoft at that time. So there was Mac OS, the earlier version of it, and there was DOS and Windows from Microsoft, and then B wanted to be this third operating system. Now, I don't know how politics works in the countries where you're from, but politics in my country, if you're not a Democrat or a Republican, you won't be elected because the American mind cannot take more than 2 choices at any given time. Maybe that's why we have binary in computers, because it's only 2 bits. So there's only 2 pieces of information for the computer to understand. Similarly to our politics, I don't think people could understand a third operating system. Like, it was just too much choice. Like, I can choose Mac or Windows, but what's this new thing out here? Why do I want that? But it was very popular with developers. It was a really interesting platform that played around with early ideas of multi-cores, multi-threaded programming, multi-threaded UI even, and also a lot of multimedia stuff that was really powerful in a way that the other operating systems were not at that time. And so it ended up being a hobby platform for a lot of developers. And some of those developers joined B and helped work on this thing that went through, various evolution stages on the way to eventually being acquired because they could not succeed on their own. They got acquired essentially for the talent. Palm came in and said, okay, we'll take those developers and some of your intellectual property, and they will develop the future operating system for our Palm devices. That ended up not happening because Palm spun out that company into Palm Source, and they ended up doing their own operating system instead for their Palm devices. So the operating system that the Palm Source former B people worked on didn't ship on any devices, but the people that worked on it learned a lot about building a platform and about starting to build a platform and a developer platform for mobile devices, because that's what they were aiming at there. So building those skills, people like Diane Hackborn, again, Brian Swetlin, Joe Honorato, Matthias Agopian, all kinds of people that were important in the early Android team built those skills and experience on B as well as Palm Source. And then finally, we have the Web TV folks. I mentioned Web TV before because Andy Rubin had worked with Chris White there, but also there were people like Mike Claron, Steve Horowitz, who ran the engineering team, other people that worked on various aspects of the platform, worked together on a development platform for applications and UI toolkit, framework, all that same stuff. It was for TVs. It wasn't for mobile devices, but it was still a developer and a user platform for this other form factor. So again, building those skills at Web TV, which then got acquired by Microsoft, continuing to work on that stuff until a lot of those people ended up at Android. So there was also something interesting going on with the team where they really had a startup mentality. Obviously, they started a startup, but again, that was only 8 of the people, and there were up to 100 people by the time they shipped 1.0. But they kept the team after the acquisition, they really kept them siloed from the rest of Google in a way that I have not seen outside of Google before. I've been in a bunch of companies where, you know, companies get acquired, and frankly, most of those acquisitions don't tend to work because there tends to be a culture mismatch or a product mismatch, and it's really hard to integrate the people, the tech, the whatever. But in Android's case, they acquired them and then they just kind of left them to their own devices. Android really didn't deal at the working level, at the individual contributor level. They didn't really deal with the rest of the company. Obviously, the leadership did, but that was where it stopped. Instead, Android was focused on what they needed to do. They weren't thinking about Google's priorities. They weren't thinking about the way that Google shipped software. They were doing their own thing entirely. And so it really continued to stay like a small startup that entire time. It was a well-funded startup because it was within Google, but it was really a very sort of driven and insular startup within that larger company. And one of the things that contributed to was this manic pace where people would drive themselves to work really hard. And I should clarify, this isn't leadership saying you need to work really hard and everybody needs to be here till 2 a.m. every night. Instead, it was the people on the team being really excited about the vision, wanting to deliver this thing and seeing, well, we've got this window of opportunity and we have a choice. We can run really hard and try to hit it, or, you know, we could relax and then who knows what's going to happen. And so everybody was really excited. Everybody worked really, really hard that entire time to try to have the opportunity to get out there in a time frame that would allow it to be successful and not just be, you know, yet another failure in the smartphone space that has had so many. One of the quotes in the book, I have a lot of quotes from many of the people that I talked to, and certainly a few from Ficus. The currency of Android was working hard. Putting in a shitload of hours was very valuable culturally. He said at another place that he doesn't think of him as being one of the smartest engineers, but he will work really hard. And I think that was true for many of the engineers, that they were putting in terms of effort, what maybe they didn't have in terms of, like, you know, brilliant observations to code up at all times. If you just keep going and keep working really hard, then that helps contribute to the product as well, because there was a lot of work that needed to be done. Decisions were an important factor as well. Certainly, there were decisions about what the technology was that they were going to ship. When Android came out, there were a few different aspects of the platform that were very interesting to both consumers and developers, and unique. They're not as unique now because, you know, things evolve and maybe some of these capabilities exist on other platforms, but things like notifications, the ability to find out when an application wants you to know something. I just received a message, I've got an email, this application needs an update, whatever it is, this communication mechanism that makes it very easy for the user to see what's going on the phone and interact with these other applications, even though you're not running them at that time. Multitasking, the recognition by the team that it was important to have a space where applications could do something very targeted because other applications could be used to do something else. So this was compared to the monolithic application space that people were more used to coming from the PCs, where you may have an application that tries to do everything you want to do in a space, as opposed to, I'm going to, you know, write an email. I'm going to copy that person's information from a contacts app. I'm going to run the camera to take a picture of myself to include in the email. And each one of those things is separate applications. And the ability to go back and forth between these applications because of the multitasking capability of Android was really key. Security was built in from day one. This has only expanded since then, as security has become, data protection and privacy protection has become more and more important to people since then. But they built it in down to the kernel level at the time. This was also a recognition that there was a difference between the PC space that we were all used to and the smartphone space. In the PC space, when I install an application, I install it as me. That application has rights to my data, just the same as if it's running as me. But they recognize that, well, this user of the smartphone, these Android phones, may install many different applications that really shouldn't have access to all of the same information. Instead, they should be sandboxed from each other. So they use the Linux kernel's notion of users or user IDs to install applications with these virtual user IDs. And now when you run an application, it runs basically as itself. It does not run as you. It runs as itself with the permission that you, the user, granted it, which means it does not automatically have access to data that other applications are producing because they're all walled off from each other. And then finally, they built in flexibility from the early days. Even though they were running really hard and fast and trying to get to 1.0 as soon as possible, they recognized that the real benefit to a platform like Android was that it would enable an ecosystem of other devices that were not being built by or with Google. And so they needed the ability for applications to be able to run in, say, a screen that was going to be a different size or a different aspect ratio. And this compares to, let's say, the iPhone at the time, which came out with one screen size for a couple of devices. And then when they did increase the screen size, they kept it at the same aspect ratio because otherwise the applications wouldn't look correct, because the way that they did layout on their devices at the time, it was really more of an absolute layout model, which is definitely easier for developers and easier to develop for the people that build the platform. But Android recognized early on, we need applications to be able to adjust on different screen sizes, different form factors. And therefore, we're going to build in this capability. It's going to take more time and thought, but it's an important thing for the platform to have so that other manufacturers can build the devices that they need to. We built developer tools from the beginning, again, recognizing that the Play Store, the Android market, and this ecosystem was going to be really important. So we wanted everything about that experience to be as accessible as possible. The language that I talked about, the APIs, the Google applications, were using the same APIs that external applications would have access to. So there was nothing special about Google apps except that Google engineers were writing them. So you should be able to build similarly powerful capabilities from the outside, from day one, because of these public APIs. The SDK that provided all the tools and the documentation, the samples, so that you could actually build these things, and then the markets where you could actually upload these applications. And then finally, some of the business decisions that were really important. The decision to go open source from the very beginning to distinguish itself from everybody else in the market. This wasn't a platform that you would have to pay Google or Android for. It wasn't a platform that was a black box that you couldn't understand. One of the ways to get other companies interested in using your platform was to make it clear to them what was going on, right? If they couldn't trust the direction that Android or Google was going in with a platform, then why would they invest their money, their people, their time in switching to this new platform if they didn't know whether next year it was going to be usable by them? But by making it open source, they basically just opened it up and said, yep, you can do whatever you want with this. Please do. And that made it more of a trusted space for these other manufacturers because they didn't have to have faith in Google or Android and their business direction because they could just go look at the code instead. They formed the Open Handset Alliance early on. This is no longer a factor. The website is pretty funny and dated. But early on, it was really important to come together with these other competing manufacturers, carriers, service companies, all of whom wanted this thing to work. And they basically came out and they had this press release. They had this cooperation between these competing companies because sure, they were competing, but they were all going to benefit by using the shared platform. And that was an important milestone, an important business achievement for the world to see that, okay, we can see how this is going to work because it's not just Google, right? It is Google plus all of these other companies that are interested in the same direction. And then finally, partnerships. If you look at the early devices that we worked on, including the G1, but also the entire series of Nexus devices and any of the other devices that we helped out with, we were going out of our way to work with different manufacturers the entire time. We worked with HTC, we worked with LG, we worked with Samsung, we worked with whoever, right? Different carriers along the way as well, because we wanted all of them to be invested in and interested in the overall ecosystem. If we had just worked with, let's say, HTC over and over and over again on one device, then maybe that would be taken as a signal by some of the other hardware manufacturers that they weren't welcome there. But instead, by basically doing round robin with all of the available manufacturers, then we made it clear that this is everybody's ecosystem to make everybody engaged in the current and the future of that platform. And then finally, the decision, I mentioned this already, the decision to actually be acquired as opposed to trying to go it on their own. They just realized, well, we're trying to do a lot of things here, and maybe it would help to actually have deep pockets from Google. And the infrastructure ended up being really important because at the point where Android did scale way, way, way up, if there were a startup, how do you acquire or nail down the server infrastructure that you need or the networking bandwidth. But if you're acquired by a company that manages something at the scale of YouTube, then maybe that's not a problem. And then leverage with partners was important as well. They found as a startup that it was maybe hard to get a callback from manufacturers that had development boards, or maybe they wanted to charge you a lot of money for those things. But if you're Google, maybe they're a little bit more interested in having that conversation because they can trust where you're going, and they're just a little more interested in talking with you about that. And then the final decision, which is undeniable, is timing. As I interviewed people for the book, talked to over 60 of them, almost all of them said variations on exactly the same quote, which was the platform was at the right place at the right time. And so you can't deny this factor. It's not yet. There were clever people working really hard, but frankly, there was a window of opportunity that they happened to hit at the right time. They worked hard to hit it, but it's a little bit hard to predict that timing aspect. But there were a couple of different things about the timing that were important. One was that the hardware is finally getting to a state where you could do something really interesting with a smartphone, and you didn't have all the limitations that you did on, say, the earlier danger devices. There were also hiring opportunities. All of those people were being freed up from those companies that I talked about earlier. So we could get, groups of people coming in that had worked together, that had domain skills, and they could basically just hit the ground running, build a sizable team very quickly with all the right skills instead of, ramping people up slowly one by one by one. And then finally, iPhone. And this is an interesting one to put in there. I think that if you look at it in hindsight, you think, well, the iPhone provided some stiff competition. How did you overcome that? And that is absolutely true, right? That's always has been a difficult competitor out there because they're a good competitor. They know what they're doing. They ship really good consumer devices. And so it keeps us on our toes. But if you think about it, what they actually did, instead of just creating competition for us, they created opportunity for Android. Because if you were a manufacturer, a hardware manufacturer in the phone space, and your name was not Apple, then you were not going to be part of any success that the iPhone might have. All of these companies saw what the iPhone was doing and said, okay, we need to compete with that. We need a smartphone platform with touchscreen capabilities, and we need it yesterday, and we don't have it. Not only that, those manufacturers were not software companies. They may have had a software platform, but it really wasn't something that you would depend on, that you would build on. That was not their skill, right? They were good at producing hardware, but now all of a sudden, the level of software that you needed to be on these devices was getting higher and higher and higher. And this was not a game that they were going to compete very well in. And so they're looking at Apple, and Apple says, well, you can't be part of our game, right? They're not licensing this platform like Microsoft licensed theirs, but Android was there. They weren't ready yet, but they were going in the right direction, and you could squint and you could see how they would get there. And now all of a sudden, these companies were interested in talking to Android about how to be part of that ecosystem. All right, so now we're at roughly 3 billion devices, give or take a zero. And does that mean we're successful? I don't think so. I think of it as still being here, because anybody that has been on a successful project before, you kind of wonder when it's going to stop being successful, right? There are so many examples of so many companies in tech that are no longer here. They were once amazing. And, where are the digital equipment corporations? Where are the Sun Microsystems? Where are all of these companies that did amazing things? And then the market moved on, right? There's this great quote from Hiroshi Lockheimer, who runs all of Android as well as Chrome and Chrome OS and other platforms at Google. Says the competition, it never ends. It's relentless. Every day we're competing. It just never feels done. That's why I'm still here. And that's why many of us are still there. We've done a lot for the platform along the way, but we have a long way to go. And there's constantly new capabilities in software, in what we can do in hardware features that we'd like to enable, in things that come up in this very competitive marketplace as, consumers want more and more, developers want more and more. And so there's always more to do that keeps it interesting. And I think the fact that we have so many devices out there and so many users and so many developers means at least we're still around so that we can work on it and keep improving it over time. So now, finally, 50 minutes into this talk, I want to get to the part that was actually the point to the talk, which is why do projects succeed? So what have we learned from all of that stuff that I just talked about, and how do we apply that to other projects that we may be working on or will work on in the rest of our career? So I boil it down to a handful of things that I'll talk through. One was having this initial vision, right? Having an idea of where you're going and then carrying through on that vision, not blindly. Like if the market changes out from under you, you're going to need to react, but actually having an idea of why you're doing this thing and where you're going. So Android at the very beginning was an open source platform. They clearly recognized, well, one way to differentiate here is to provide a platform that other manufacturers are interested in taking a look at. If we make it too much of an Android specific, our own IP platform, then everybody will be scared away from it. This is what some of the Palm Source people found, that yes, they had this platform and other manufacturers may have wanted to use it, but they were also afraid of Palm Source having this vested interest in this platform. And therefore, how much could they trust the direction that this was going in? But making it open source, making it freely available, removed those barriers and made it much easier for other manufacturers to adopt that. There was also a notion of being a product and a platform. And this was an ongoing debate on the team the entire way through. But from the beginning, they wanted to build and enable this phone that eventually came out, originally the Sooner, and then the Dream device that became the G1, and then there would be other follow-on devices. But they were also building a platform. Like that G1 device only had one screen size, but they were building in the capability in the platform to handle other screen sizes and other densities, because they also wanted it to be a platform that other manufacturers could ship devices for. It wasn't all going to be Google devices. That was never the plan. Focus, the ability to actually keep the team aimed at the goal is really important, especially in something like an acquisition or working in a really big company. There are so many things going on. It's so easy to get distracted by other projects, other priorities, other teams asking you for things. One of the things that I think really helped Android early on was the fact that the leadership team in Android really did silo them. They created these really hard walls around the team so that the team wasn't distracted by anything else that Google wanted to do. It was really easy to get distracted at that time because Google was working on tons of things: web, framework, infrastructure, networking, whatever. And they would have had many requests for Android at the time, but Android needed to focus on just shipping 1.0 and that initial device. And they were very good at doing that, basically by closing the doors and saying, go away, we're busy. Maybe not a very polite approach, but it was what they needed at that time to hit that small window of opportunity. There was also a notion where being siloed really built loyalty to the product and the team and the vision. As I said, everybody was working really hard, but they weren't doing it because the executives told them to. They were doing it because they bought into the vision. They knew, hey, this is a really exciting thing and I could be a part of that. And so it is worth my time and energy and focus and hard work to try to help the team get there. And that's something that's a little bit difficult if you're not all focused in on the same goal. If you don't have that sort of built-in loyalty and you're all running in the same direction together over that long period of time. Hiring the right people is important, even when they don't necessarily fit the company, right? So Google at that time was really picky about resumes. They if you're coming in as an engineer, they kind of liked people that came from top engineering schools, and yet Android had a lot of people that didn't come from top engineering schools. In fact, they had a lot of people that didn't even have college degrees. In fact, Ficus, who we saw a quote from earlier, didn't even have a high school degree, right? But they came in with exactly the right experience for Android. So Android had to work around the Google system and say, okay, well, we don't want, the engineers that may succeed at Google. We really need engineers that have embedded experience, that have mobile experience, that have developer platform, API experience, which is really unusual for the kinds of engineers that Google was hiring at that time. But they realized, okay, we need to focus on this. This is how we're going to build a team really quickly with the right experience so that we can, again, hit the ground running and hit that very small window of opportunity that's open. Working hard. I brought this one up before. Like, I don't think it's necessary to burn yourself really hard to have a nice life and have successful projects, but it was certainly a factor in them being able to hit that small window of opportunity that they had, especially when they had to pivot and said, okay, well, this iPhone thing came out. That means, we need to pivot. We need to ship this other device first. We need to run really hard and get that out there as soon as possible before the market takes over and that window closes, right? But it's important to point out that Not only, again, was the team driving themselves as opposed to being driven, but also there was a point in time when they were able to back off of this. If you just keep working hard over and over and over again, you will burn out. I call that a death march. I think other people do as well. That is not healthy at all, right? If you just keep going and it seems like you're never going to get there, then you never will, right? What's important is you can work really hard for a particular goal, and then hopefully you will achieve that goal. And at that point, you can sort of back off a little bit and get into more of a normal rhythm. Eventually, around the KitKat release, so by the time I got there, the team was not working as hard as they had before. I was still working quite hard at that time, but it was not the sort of, everybody there early in the morning, every night and most weekends. Instead, it was like, yeah, there was a lot of late nights and some weekends in there, but a little bit more sane. But then a couple of years after that, we finally got to a pace where there was enough platform capability that we had built in that we did not need to run just to catch up. And then we started shipping annual releases. The team got big enough that there were enough people to handle the work there. And then we got into more of a sane way of working, which was really good, because if they were still running that hard on into 2013, 14, a lot of the early people simply would have left, right? Because they would have burned out. You don't want to do that forever. Competition ends up being good in a couple of ways. One is that I think competition fosters all of the companies to think about things that they can do to make their product better so that they can compete really well in a marketplace. If they're the only one out there, then maybe they have no incentive to do that. But if you're running really fast because someone is right behind you or beside you or in front of you, then you're going to come up with better ideas because you have to. Right. But it also enables some really interesting business dynamics, like I talked about with the iPhone. Sure, iPhone provided and continues to provide fantastic competition, which spawns a lot of great thinking, a lot of great ideas, a lot of great product decisions on both sides. But also it created that opening for Android. If the name of your company was not Apple, or if you weren't the carrier that was in that particular market, if you weren't in the US named AT&T, what are you going to do? Right. Well, that opened up the conversation between those companies and Google. And then together we could actually come up with something that ended up working. Also, I think it's important to just keep going. If we look at this graph, you can see, well, the team was working. I mean, it goes off to the left too, right? For most of 2005, that's when the engineering really kicked in. They were working, and then finally delivered at the end of 2008, and they had very few users. The G1 was interesting, but it was by no means a successful product. But they still had that vision of what they needed to do to get there. And so they just kept going so that they could reach that initial vision they were shooting for. And then eventually the hockey stick kicked in and they could see attraction by other manufacturers' devices worldwide. And then things finally started to get to the point where they wanted to at the beginning. But if they had waited till, we launched the G1 and now we can relax. Well, no, right? Because that was not enough. They needed to put more in, more effort, more time, more features and capabilities before they could get to the place where they could say, okay, now we can realize the initial dream. Timing I talked about. Obviously, this is really important. You can't control it, but you can be aware of what's happening. You can be aware of whether, a market is opening up or whether it is closing down. If you want to ship a cross-platform UI toolkit on PCs right now, well, the timing for that was several years ago. That's probably not a huge market right now. So just being aware of what's going on in the world is really important, but also being aware when things change and being able to pivot. So the folks on Android could see that window opening. They could see the convergence of all of these hardware capabilities, and they could react to that and say, okay, we've got to take advantage of this in the following ways. And they could also pivot really quickly so that when there was a change, when the iPhone came out and they realized, okay, touchscreens are really important, we're going to pivot on a dime. Within a matter of days, they said, okay, here's the change in product direction. And now we're going to refocus in this other way to make sure that we ship the right device as the first device. So it's not that you can create the timing, but you can certainly react to it and be aware of it and hopefully have the right team in place to be able to react really quickly, because that is what timing is all about. And then finally, you can't deny the factor of just luck. There's this great quote that the book starts with from, again, Ficus. Anytime anything works out, if you don't acknowledge the huge luck factor, you're kind of a jerk. So there's two aspects to this. One is, if you're on a successful project, hey, good job. I'm sure your team was really awesome and you had some great ideas and you were able to get it out there, and that's fabulous. But you have to acknowledge that luck was part of it. You got there at the right time. You happen to find the right people. You happen to find the right business dynamics. And so you can sort of back off the overconfidence about everything. It's not because your team are all the most amazing people. I'm sure they are, but maybe there was a bit of luck into it as well. But also, many projects fail. In fact, most projects fail. In fact, most of the projects I've worked on haven't been hugely successful in my career. And I think the same is true for probably most people in the audience. And again, you have to acknowledge that maybe luck was a factor there as well. So maybe it's not all your fault that those didn't work. Maybe the timing didn't happen to work. Maybe the competition wasn't right, whatever it is. So then at that point, what can we do with the failures? We can learn from them. We can take a step back and we can try again. That is the end of my talk. I think I have probably 20 minutes for questions. I don't know if there's any that have been coming in the chat. I'll leave it up to the host to figure out how we do this. Oh, I should point out too, the other factor here, if you're going to write a book, is to have a great cartoonist on your engineering team. I work with this person named Dan Sandler, who runs the system UI team for Android and has for years. He's done the Easter eggs for the last several releases. He's done some of the logos, like the famous bee that we had for Honeycomb. It's the best thing about the Honeycomb release. And he also did the drawings for the book, and I think they're fabulous.
Oh, Chet, thank you so much. That was a fantastic. As you were talking about, Honeycomb and the pre 1.0 version of Android, there's just a flood of memories coming back with all these white hairs that used to be black.
Yeah, I've got a few of those myself. That was not an easy release to work on, and not our best either.
Yeah, but still, like it's a building block that kind of led us to where it is today. Thank you so much for such an informative talk that you condensed into a couple of minutes. And of course, like if the audiences want to have better access of the rest of the information, they can always go for the book and have the full set of information available. Cool. I think let's jump into the questions. Interestingly, one of our audience was actually commented about it's an unspoken rule that we don't talk about Honeycomb. So let's try to talk about Honeycomb actually.
Sure.
So interestingly, like in building Android, there were a couple of decisions that were made right along the way, whereby people like, say, for example, Diane, who thought a lot about building a platform. So a lot of her decisions actually has to do with things that would scale. So one of the things that she worked on was Intense, which to this day we're still using it. And then there are also some decisions that were made, such as building things fast for Honeycomb specifically, which the Android team never open source because that would cause problems. So do you want to share a little bit more about how we should what principles should we use to think about building for scalability and like a quick release?
Sure. These are very unrelated questions, so I'm going to sort of take them one at a time. So there was an interesting dynamic in the early team where they ran really fast. They made very pragmatic decisions and moved on. Like when Andy said, okay, we're doing Java, and everybody just said, okay, that's it. We'll do Java. And they stopped thinking about JavaScript and C++, and they moved on because they didn't have the time to continue debating. The Intense and also activity lifecycle, that ended up being a source of debate on the team for a while. And there were people on the team that were not happy about that decision. At the time, there are obviously still developers dealing with the complexity of some of those decisions. On the other hand, there was a decision, taken by Diane and other people on the team that we really need to scale this in a way that goes beyond the more simplistic model that other developers were recommending, because Diane could see several years into the future. I think Mike Claron has a quote in there about, like, she's always programming like 6 years into the future. She could see, well, if this is a successful developer platform, here's where we need to be, as opposed to, the pragmatic, the immediate decision would have been like, well, we'll just, we'll have a simple run loop where everything happens, and, we're going to have sockets that we talk over, and like more traditional straightforward, simple mechanisms, but she was looking into the future saying, no, it's important to be able to launch these other applications. This is based partly on earlier experience that she and some of her team had coming from Palm Source, where they had similar capabilities over there and saw some benefit from that obviously more complicated architecture. And it does bring out complicated things like, okay, well, when you launch this other application, then your foreground application gets paused. You need to handle that activity lifecycle thing. And it was really hard for some people on the team because, of course, they were just trying to get to 1.0, and this was introducing architectural complexity. But that was the decision. That was the product versus platform decision that she was taking at the time, saying, no, this is really important because we're going to need a more flexible platform going forward. And an important point about that decision was it wasn't just Diane saying this is the way it's going to be, or other people on the team. It wasn't just, Andy was a person who could make that call and push the decision through, but the real way that most engineering decisions like intents and activities got made was somebody would sit down and write the code. So there was debates going on and people going back and forth, and around circles for a while. And then one day Diane just sat down and wrote the code that they needed, and they moved on. Right. The way that a lot of the important decisions were made early on was if somebody provided a solution, that was it. The same thing with the UI toolkit. There was a debate going on between the Skia team, which had an early version of a toolkit that they had that was based around, I think, JavaScript and XML. And then other people on the framework team, including Joe Honorato, who thought, well, we should have this Java-based API approach instead. And then one day Joe came in and he sat down for 24 hours and he wrote the UI toolkit. Right, the early version. It ended up getting rewritten, but it at least pointed the team in a particular direction. And they said, well, decision is made, the code exists, let's move on. I think in terms of Honeycomb, there was a conspiracy theory at the time when we shipped Honeycomb and we didn't ship open source, that, we were backing off on the open source promise at the time, and that absolutely wasn't the case. Instead, what happened was we really needed to deliver Honeycomb specifically to handle tablet capabilities, because this is when tablets were becoming a big thing. We, enabled the Zoom tablet. More importantly, we enabled tablet capabilities and architectural things like fragments for other manufacturers to produce their own tablets, because tablets based on the earlier phone platform capabilities were not good, right? So we needed something better architecturally and internally. And so we did that with Honeycomb, but we did not have time to do that and also build in all the capabilities that were necessary for that release to run well on phones. So we didn't want people to run it on phones. We didn't want them to take Honeycomb and put it on their phone devices, because we hadn't even done that ourselves, because we really just needed to ship Honeycomb. It was late enough as it was. That was as close as we got to a death march, at least while I've been there, because, we targeted one deadline and we couldn't make that. And we just kept slipping it out because, the thing just wasn't ready yet. And we kept slipping and slipping, but at some point we needed to ship it. So we took the decision, we need to ship Honeycomb, and the next release is going to have the phone capabilities that we need to build in. And that is the point where we actually ship the open source, because that's the point where we said, yes, people are allowed to build a phone for this now, because we've actually tested it ourselves.
That makes sense. Thank you so much, Chet.
Sure.
Okay, we have a question from the audience, so I'm going
Great.
to flash it on the screen. All right, so this is a question from Harizon, who's asking about in terms of how I would say like the beginnings of Android, and how did the company and the product sustain itself at the beginning?
Good question. I don't know the details to that. I do know that Andy had some initial, I don't know. I assume it was self-funded, as a lot of startups are at the beginning, because I assume that, Andy came in with some amount of funding from his earlier startup since he started Danger. When they started hiring people, that's kind of when you need someone else's money. And I believe he was able to attract a little bit of angel investment. So it wasn't enough money to, run a company on, but it was more like probably enough to make payroll for some amount of time without going too far into debt. But at the point where they realized, okay, this is the vision for the platform, this is what we're going to build. So when they were doing the pitch to investors, which would have been in the sort of late winter and spring of 2005, they had the 4 founders who maybe they were able to self-fund themselves. And then there was Brian Sweatland and Tracy, and then they brought in Fadden, Andy McFadden, around that same time, sort of spring time frame. And now it's starting to grow to the point where, okay, we need a dependable income stream to pay payroll. And they were still looking for more people because you weren't going to, build the whole Android platform with just those two engineers. They basically saw this ramp saying, here's the engineering team that we need. Where's that money going to come from? And that's when they approached VCs to get that funding.
Awesome. Thanks.
All right. So I have a question regarding how the team makes decisions. So how does the team decide whether to purchase or to build? For example, the team decided to go with Java and they went ahead and built a whole runtime. And for video, so they just decided to go with Packet Video as the solution.
Yep.
But the code was bad. Eventually, it had to be rewritten, right?
Yes. Yeah, great question. Very different dynamics in both of those. So for the runtime, they actually evaluated both. They brought in an engineer named Dan Bornstein, who had built the runtime that was on Danger. So he had done this kind of thing. Brian Sweatland had done some of that work as well. And so Brian reached out to Dan. They brought in Dan. And Dan's job was not to write Dalvik, but it was to create a runtime. And that could be something that they acquired. And there were some runtimes out there in the wider world, or it could be something that they built. And so they in the meantime, like while he was working on that, evaluating what the options were and thinking about building their own, they used some other runtimes as placeholders. JamVM and I can't remember the other, Waba, were runtimes for Java class files. They were open source. It was not the intention to use those long term. They were more placeholders while they evaluated something more performant. But they eventually decided, because it's such a constrained device, we really want more control over the bytecode. We don't want to handle the generic Java bytecode that a Java runtime would handle. Instead, we need our own runtime that's going to handle our bytecode. So they were able to make some efficiencies and optimizations in the bytecode that was produced in the DEX Dalvik executable bytecode, such that they needed their own runtime in order to understand, in order to suck that in and run that bytecode instead. On the acquire versus build stuff, there was a whole lot of technology that needed to be provided in the video space and audio space. And it was just deemed easier by Andy, presumably others as well, to just say, you know what, we need so much written here that maybe Ficus is not going to, have all the time to write that stuff. And this included, decoders, encoders, for audio as well as video. And a lot of that technology did exist in the world. And so I think it was just a matter of money, saying, well, money and time, how long is it going to take us to do this stuff? How many engineering hours is it going to take to provide that, versus just going out and acquiring the technology? So they acquired this company called, they didn't acquire a company. They acquired the technology from Packet Video, including the rights to publish the source code for that. It was eventually rewritten. It ended up being not the code that the team wanted to maintain in the long term, but it did allow them to get to the level of capability that they needed for 1.0. So there were, fragility or maintenance issues with it long term, but I think it did allow them to just pass by that and say, okay, pragmatic solution. We got this technology, we'll add it in here and we'll go. One of the important things that they worked around, some of the limitations of that particular code, though, was that they exposed such a limited API surface on top of it that they weren't backed into a corner of having to continue to use it. So they just had the ability to, load and play these files, essentially, which meant that in the future, they were able to completely replace everything underneath because the API didn't point them in a particular direction that would have locked them into that solution.
All right, thank you.
Cool.
I do have a hard stop in 7 minutes because someone else is going to want this room. So up until then, I'm good.
I think we have also time for just one last question. I think we have Caleb, who was asking about hiring. So how did the Android team know which type of engineers to hire when you're working with them, and the kind of checklist and
Yep.
yeah.
I think it depended on the team that was actually trying to hire. I mean, very early on, there was just a generic requirement of, people that had worked with development platforms, embedded devices, because they were still very limited hardware at that time, kernel drivers, system level stuff, as well as mobile platforms, so that people knew how to deal with this, constrained mobile environment that they were going to be in. But beyond that, it was specific to the team. So if you were, Brian Swetlin, and you wanted to bring someone in to work on system stuff, you were going to look for developers that knew about the Linux kernel, that knew about writing drivers. So they were going to bring in people like Rebecca from the platforms team at Google. She transferred over because she'd been working on kernel stuff over there. San Mahat similarly transferred from the kernel team over in Google, because he basically had been, building driver kind of stuff for his entire career. If you're Diane Hackborn and you're looking for someone new for your framework team, you're going to want someone that has dealt a lot with developer platforms, so API surfaces, as well as operating system capability, because framework is kind of the higher level of the operating system, as well as just developer platforms in general. The ability to get at the operating system capabilities and expose them through APIs so that developers can access them, or handle complex architectures like the the multi-process intent stuff that we were talking about before. If you're if you're on the media team, you're going to look for someone that has dealt with audio, like you're going to pull in Marco, who they also got from Palm Source, who had worked on audio related technology for years. There was one other area I was thinking of. Oh yeah, the services team is interesting. The person they brought in to run that was Michael Morrissey, and he had done services kind of stuff and persistent connection stuff at Danger, and so he had a really good idea of what they needed to do in terms of providing, that connection back to the back ends, how to provide download capabilities, how to have a check-in service. So he kind of had the architecture in mind, or the types of applications and services that they would need, and then he specifically looked inside of Google. So the rest of the team, I mentioned some Google engineers that came over from Google, but most of the engineers came from outside, because Google didn't really have a lot of engineers that did this kind of stuff. But Michael specifically looked inside of Google, because if they were going to connect Android applications to services inside of Google, then you really needed engineers with that experience, as opposed to bringing in external developers and then them not knowing how to talk to the servers on the back end. So it really was based on, the kind of technology they're trying to build and the people running that team, and the types of engineers and engineering work that needed to be done.
Super cool. Thank you so much.
Yep.
All right. Oh, I guess we're done with the questions. All right.
Okay.
Thank you, Chet, for your time, giving us a wonderful history lesson on Android, and the interesting tidbits and insights on how the team scaled from zero to where it is now. So thank you so much again for taking your time to join us.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for having me. I hope people learned and enjoyed.
Certainly, we did.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, so before we end off today's event, don't go yet. We just want to go through, the upcoming events that are going to be coming in the next few weeks. In fact, this next event is going to be coming just next week, next Wednesday, in this same time slot. Earlier on, we did introduce about this, so just to go at it again. If you are interested in thinking about volunteering in tech, like you see the three of us over here, we're doing this event. We're volunteering, in fact, for the tech communities. And if you're interested in doing something similar, giving back, and thinking about how this can help you as well, in terms of your growth in your career, do join this event. Even if you are a tech organizer, we'll also be asking, questions in terms of, how to cope with handling your community, how to grow it in the long term. So do look out for this event next week, 3rd of November. Okay, and following on 1 week after that, we're going to have the Android Dev Summit extended. We're going to have 2 speakers. So Saga is the first speaker. I think if the next one is Xiao Dao. Yeah, so this is November 10th again on Wednesday as well. Yeah, exact same time slot. So book this few Wednesdays. Make sure you book all your time slots for the Wednesdays and join us for all events. And last but not least, we do have an engineer from Facebook who also will be joining us. Earlier on we talked about her her experiences as IC, and we're expecting this to be in the December period. So do check out our. I think when you go to the next slide, you're gonna see like some of our social media channels. So make sure you go and follow all of those. Definitely we're gonna be posting our event details there, and we hope to see all of you all then. All right. Okay, so yep, last but not least, this is all different social media channels. Make sure that you follow our YouTube channel. This is where we're going to be doing all our live streams. And like especially I think for most of you who are on YouTube right now. Yep. So let's end off today's event. I think make sure you like, share, subscribe this content. All right. See you guys. Bye.